Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a stack of source material that gives us just an unprecedented level of detail regarding one of the most visible and I think ongoing ideological conflicts in Europe right now, the mass political activism that's gripping London.
That's right. Our sources today are transcripts from a really intensive on-the-ground investigation. This was conducted right in the middle of a major Free Palestine protest. So this isn't your typical news
Oh,
coverage.
yeah, not at all.
This is raw. It's candid conversations with everyone from, paid organizers to asylum seekers to, frankly, just disgruntled citizens caught in the middle of it all. And we're using this very granular material to execute a pretty specific mission today.
And that mission is really to move past the noise, past the slogans, and dissect three core elements that I think explain the true anatomy of this conflict. So first, we really need to understand the financial infrastructure. Who's organizing this? Who's funding these events? Where's the money actually flowing?
And second, we have to examine the complex and often very contradictory reality of the asylum money trail and the migration policy in the UK.
Which is a huge topic in itself.
A huge topic.
Yeah.
And third, we're looking at how these deeply contrasting and often anti-Western ideologies are, well, manifesting and colliding on British streets today.
Our goal here is to pull out those surprising nuggets of knowledge. We're talking about the specific, undeniable financial figures, the clear organizational connections, and some of the just utterly candid admissions that really challenge these core Western assumptions about seeking refuge and, what political protest even is anymore.
Yeah, we're going to start immediately by connecting that political fervor to pure commerce. And from there, dive into a fascinating and frankly frustrating story that challenges the basic integrity of the asylum system itself.
Okay, let's unpack this initial scene, because the sources, they don't start with a chant or a big speech. They start with something much more mundane. They start with the commercial activity happening on the fringes of this demonstration.
Right. And what was immediately clear was that this highly charged political march was also, in a very real sense, a marketplace.
A marketplace. So what are we talking about?
Well, the investigation noted vendors strategically positioned, selling keffiyehs, that powerful symbol of Palestinian solidarity. And they were priced at £20 each.
20 pounds.
£20. And this introduces a fascinating layer of, well, monetization right at the entry point of the whole event.
And the economics attached to this are quite revealing, aren't they? Especially when we talk about just the daily cash flow. What did the vendor actually tell the investigator about his sales volume?
He was surprisingly open about it. This specific vendor, a man we later learned is from Syria, he claimed he sells between 30 and 35 keffiyehs every single day during these protests.
Every day. So if we just do the quick math on that, even the conservative estimate, 30 sold at 20 pounds.
That's £600 in daily revenue.
600 pounds in cash, presumably.
Mostly, yes. He did acknowledge that, some of that income goes toward taxes and some to a donation. But regardless of the split, for a single day's work just selling merchandise on the street, that represents a really significant and consistent cash flow.
The whole idea that political solidarity is immediately commercialized and often quite profitably is probably the first big disruption to that purely organic protest narrative.
It is. And it's also notable where the merchandise even came from.
Right, because the investigator asked him, didn't he?
He did. And the vendor disclosed that the keffiyehs were not sourced from Palestine. He just identified himself as just a worker from Syria.
So for him, at least on some level, this protest is fundamentally an economic opportunity. It's not necessarily a manifestation of, localized political solidarity.
That's what the detail suggests, yes.
Now, before we get into this vendor's much deeper story, we should probably acknowledge the environment the investigator walked into. The source material notes a specific tactic that was being used for, well, intimidation.
Yes. The investigator noticed right away that he was being photographed by other protesters. This is a very common tactic. It's about documenting individuals who are perceived as outsiders or critics.
And what's the purpose of that?
It's often for intimidation or for sharing their picture in encrypted group chats. It sets a very clear tone that this is an organized, surveilled environment. And that really sets the stage for the later revelation of the professional activists who are involved.
That tension makes the next interaction, the one with the Syrian vendor, even more remarkable because he was so incredibly candid about his entire journey across Europe.
He was.
He basically outlined what the investigator described as a kind of transnational utilization of welfare systems.
The interviewee's journey is truly eye-opening. He says he came from Syria, walking, and I'm quoting here, by his feet all the way to Sweden.
All the way to Sweden.
All the way. And once he was in Sweden, he successfully applied for asylum and refugee status. He said he was detained briefly, just for the necessary checks, before that status was granted.
Let's focus on the financial specifics of the Swedish system first, because the scale of investment in migration there is, according to these sources, just immense.
It's colossal. The source material reveals that Sweden spent 16 billion SEK, which is right now equivalent to over 1.6 billion US dollars on migrants. And that's in just one reporting period.
Over $1.5 billion.
And crucially, that massive figure excludes the costs of specific integration programs. It excludes gender equality initiatives or introduction services. Those are all entirely separate budget line items. It just shows a profound state commitment.
So what specifically was this individual and others like him entitled to once he actually secured a residence permit in Sweden?
The benefits are substantial. They're clearly designed to encourage integration and stability. So he received initial aid during the first year for learning Swedish, which, by the way, he speaks very well, along with English and Arabic.
Sure, he's multilingual.
Very. But the most valuable long-term incentives are educational. Once that residency is secured, university tuition becomes completely free.
Free university.
Free! On top of that, the state provides grants that can exceed $12,000 per year. And that's alongside access to public health care and all the standard family benefits. He confirmed he received all of this, and he worked for a while in a factory before deciding to move on.
But the sources also provide some really critical context about the Swedish policy environment. This might explain his decision to move. It wasn't just a simple benefit program. The program itself was facing huge political pressure.
That's a vital piece of context. The source notes that Sweden's very open-door policy came under intense public scrutiny, especially after some statistics emerged. For instance, that 63% of those convicted of rape in a certain period had a foreign background.
And that led to a policy change.
A dramatic one. In response, the Swedish government has shifted policy. They are now offering migrants a substantial financial payout. We're talking £37,000 to voluntarily leave the country.
So just to be clear, we have an individual who benefited from free education, grants, and support in Sweden. Then, instead of maybe taking that £37,000 to return home, he moves to the UK.
That's right.
And this is where we hit that massive policy contradiction in Britain.
This is the core destabilizing contradiction of the whole story. The official position of the UK government, under things like the Dublin Regulation Principle, is that they do not accept individuals who have already received asylum status in another safe, democratic country, like Sweden.
But he did.
But he did. The interviewee openly and frankly admitted he secured asylum in Sweden and then moved to the UK. He just said he felt the UK was better, that it offered more financial opportunities. Initially, he said he found more work here, though the main work he mentioned was delivery driving for DPD.
And once he arrived in the UK, he was able to tap into the British asylum support system, which is a system that is itself facing, a staggering financial strain.
The UK's commitment is astronomical. The investigation detailed that the UK spent $2.8 billion of its aid budget, plus an additional $4.7 billion through the Home Office just on asylum support.
And that was in just 1 year.
In just 1 year. So we are talking about close to £7.5 billion dedicated to running the system annually. This context is absolutely critical when you discuss the benefits provided to this specific person.
So what were the specifics of his UK support package? What did he get?
He was completely transparent about it. He admitted to receiving benefits immediately upon his arrival. He gets £300 a month in cash.
Okay.
But the major component, and this is where UK costs really diverge from some others, is that the government pays his housing rent.
The rent is fully covered.
Fully covered. For his room in Birmingham, he estimated the rent was somewhere between £300 and £400 per month. This means the state is absorbing the single largest cost burden for living in the UK, which is housing. It's a cost that is crippling for many native Britons.
So while the cash component is only £300, the true value of that benefit package is much, much higher because of the paid housing.
Oh, much higher. He also clarified he received no direct assistance with food or health care, just the cash and the housing. But just like in Sweden, the most valuable benefit he received here was educational.
This is where that disparity becomes so striking.
It really is. He noted it very casually that they just put you in college. When you consider that British citizens typically pay around £9,000, sometimes £10,000 a year for university attendance.
And incur decades of debt for it.
Decades of debt. But for a Syrian refugee who arrived via Sweden, that cost can be zero. The sources specifically referenced institutions like the University of Birmingham, which offer full scholarships covering all tuition and funded accommodation for asylum seekers.
And there are stipends, too.
There can be. If he had, say, opted for a place like Leeds, he could have potentially received a £10,000 annual stipend on top of the free tuition.
That is a staggering sequence of welfare benefits, secured across 2 major European states, allowing him to potentially leave with 2 years of free, top-tier education and cash savings.
It is.
And this leads us to the core issue, which I guess we can call the asylum paradox. He revealed his future plans, and they fundamentally undermine the reason he sought asylum in the first place.
He stated it unequivocally. He is saving my money, and he is not thinking of staying in the UK long term.
And what's his timeline for leaving? What did he say?
He plans to go back to Syria in a year maximum. He stated it plainly, it's enough here.
And that's the paradox right there.
It is. The foundational premise of international asylum law is the fear of persecution or danger if the person returns voluntarily. If this individual is able to save money and then plans a voluntary return to the country he allegedly fled,
it implies that the core justification for granting him asylum, that existential threat, is no longer present.
or perhaps, as the source material suggests, was never the primary driving factor to begin with.
The investigator in the source material draws a very, very sharp conclusion from this sequence of events. The transnational use of benefits, the free education, the planned return.
Yes, the investigator states that Western countries are essentially paying for the destruction of their own culture by facilitating this kind of transparent utilization of the asylum system. Now, while that is a powerful indictment, our analysis is simply to note that the data supports the observation. Massive state resources are being consumed by individuals who openly view their presence as temporary and, well, transactional.
And that personal financial story, it leads us so naturally into the broader ideological picture that was captured in these sources. The UK system is obviously designed with institutional assimilation efforts. What did the interviewees say about those?
Well, the institutions are clearly pushing for integration. Job centers encourage work. They often suggest warehouse jobs, delivery jobs, and college placement is readily offered, which he took full advantage of.
Right.
However, the internal ideological commitment of the interviewee, it seems to remain quite rigid, despite leveraging all these Western systems.
And the conversation turned pretty quickly to the demographic shifts happening in the UK, which is a major point of discussion in the source material, particularly the growth of Islam. How did he respond to that concern?
He was measured but very firm. He framed the issue around religious rights and freedom of choice. He stated that everyone has a right to their religion, and if Islam is growing not by force, then it's fine.
So he presents it as a peaceful democratic process, conversion, individual choice, as long as there's no coercion involved.
Exactly. But that measured response, it hits a point of friction when the interviewer brings up the demographic consequences of large family sizes. The observation of many Muslim residents in areas like Whitechapel with very large families, suggesting a strategy for long-term demographic rooting.
And how did he react to that?
Well, this is where the disconnect becomes clear. When he's asked about high birth rates and setting down roots, the interviewee frames having 1 child or 100 children as purely a personal right.
He dismissed the anxiety over it.
Completely. He suggested those who are worrying that we will have nothing left are, in his words, thinking too far. And this is a profound clash of perspective. The observer sees a potential threat to national identity and political future, while the interviewee sees only individual liberty and religious right.
What's absolutely fascinating is that this individual, who is benefiting so profoundly from the welfare state, then offers this incredibly sharp critique of the very system that's supporting him.
This is a moment of pure, surprising insight in the transcript.
Yeah.
The interviewer used the example of a non-English-speaking woman who had been on government benefits for 6 years as a kind of hypothetical taxpayer grievance.
And the Syrian man agreed with the grievance.
He agreed emphatically. He stated that if he were an English taxpayer paying taxes for someone else to just sit on benefit, he will be upset.
So he completely validated the English taxpayer's position, didn't he?
He did. He distinguished himself by noting that he worked quickly after only a brief period on benefits, but he absolutely acknowledged the validity of the anger that's directed at long-term, unassimilated benefit recipients. It shows a very practical rather than ideological understanding of the welfare state's failure points.
However, that ideological alignment comes into extremely sharp focus when the conversation shifts to the geopolitical conflict. His statements regarding Israel are, well, they're absolute and uncompromising.
They leave no room for ambiguity. None at all. Statement 1. Israel will not stay in Israel. He then declared that for Arabs and Muslims, there is nothing named Israel.
That's a complete and total rejection of Israel's historical or future legitimacy as a state.
Complete and absolute. And then the conversation moved towards the potential for future violence, an idea he framed using language that evokes fear and a very clear threat.
What did he say?
He stated that something bigger than October 7th is coming. When he was pressed on what mechanism would achieve this goal, he clarified the intent. He said, Palestine will be free is not by peace, by power.
By power.
By power. This is the moment in the transcript where the intent moves from just political demonstration to an explicit acceptance of armed, violent liberation if negotiation fails.
And he also offers a kind of reciprocal justification for potential violence directed at the West itself.
He does. Statement 3 lays out the rhetorical framework. He claimed that if China, which was used contextually in the source to mean the West, continues to bomb innocent people in Gaza, then they have a right to do whatever they do.
So it's a justification.
It's a framework that is essential for understanding the activist mindset here, that Western intervention and military action are the primary drivers of instability and refugee flows, and therefore violence against the West is a justifiable, proportional response to that perceived aggression.
But the most profound ideological separation, I think, comes when he discusses political governance itself. He explicitly rejects Western democracy for his own country.
This is where we grasp the gravity of the ideological divide. He stated it plainly, I don't want to have democracy in his country, and his rationale is incredibly specific.
What was it?
Because it's from the West. He says he prefers his own laws and his own system. He views democracy not as some universal ideal, but as an imposition, a culturally specific adversarial product of the West that he actively rejects.
So he is here leveraging the financial and educational systems of the West, but at the same time, he's rejecting its core political foundation. And he reiterated that his presence here is purely transactional.
Exactly. He repeated it. I had to be here. I'm saving money. I'm going back.
Oh.
He framed his time in the UK as a necessary, temporary transaction. And he concluded this part of the conversation by throwing the responsibility for his presence entirely back onto the Western powers.
How so?
He said, if you don't want people to come here to UK, then stop making war in their countries. Nobody will come here. This narrative is self-reinforcing. It justifies his utilization of the system as a direct consequence of Western aggression.
And to contextualize the potential implications of this anti-Western ideology being, harbored within the welfare system, the source has brought up a very sobering statistic from Denmark.
The comparison is chilling. Denmark, a Nordic neighbor with very similar welfare models, previously took in 321 Palestinian refugees. They found that 64% of them subsequently became convicted criminals.
64%.
64. Now, Denmark no longer accepts Palestinian refugees, but that statistic provides a stark warning about the potential hidden cost of prioritizing these open-door policies over, say, ideological and security screening, especially when individuals are openly rejecting the foundational values of their host nation.
It sets the stage perfectly for our next section, because now we move from the financial and ideological reality of the individual asylum seeker to the massive, organized, and politically extreme infrastructure that actively mobilizes and funds these mass movements.
Right. Moving from the personal to the structural, we're now analyzing the professional, organized infrastructure that was revealed in the investigation, the core of the activism that ensures these protests are large, sustained, and highly visible.
The investigator immediately encountered a woman named Catherine Hayani, who is explicitly identified in the sources as a paid protester. Let's examine the details of her professional background.
Her LinkedIn profile confirms this professional status. Since October 2023, she has been employed by the Stop the War Coalition. Her title, Head for National Gaza Demonstrations.
So this isn't a volunteer position.
No, this is a full-time, salaried role dedicated solely to organizing the exact protest we're analyzing. It indicates a clear professionalization of activism in the UK.
And her organizational ties, they link this London protest directly into U.S. funding streams and major global anti-Western movements.
That's a critical link. She's worked professionally with groups like Code Pink, and as the source material details, Code Pink is run by Jodie Evans, who is married to Roy Neville Singham.
And Singham is a major funder of these movements.
A major funder. He's been extensively documented as funding anti-Western rallies and efforts globally, contributing an estimated $20 million to these causes. So this establishes a clear financial pipeline that connects U.S.-based funding aimed at undermining Western interests directly to the paid organizers orchestrating mass protests on British soil.
This suggests she's a career activist, not just someone who has spontaneously moved to action after October 7th.
Precisely. Her background confirms this. Before her current role, she taught Syrian and Palestinian refugees. She was also a campaign assistant for nuclear disarmament, organizing protests, handling inquiries, and she worked for the Council for Arab-British Understanding.
So a long history in this space.
A long history. The sources argue this consistent employment history shows that the focus isn't just a singular cause, but a broader, long-term anti-imperialist and socialist agenda.
And that underlying socialist agenda was explicitly visible at the protests, right? Right down to the specific political groups who were present.
Absolutely. The Socialist Workers Party, or SWAP, they had their tents and signs prominently displayed. They're often stamping their own affiliation onto the Freedom for Palestine placards. Their ideology is unapologetic, hard-left socialism.
And what is their core stated purpose in participating in these events?
The SWP states its purpose is twofold. First, to fight for socialism, and second, to protest the complicity of Britain in international conflicts. Their argument is structural. They contend that the violence we see globally is, in their words, actually part of the system that we live in.
So they're connecting the conflict in the Middle East directly to the need for a socialist revolution within the UK itself.
That's the ideological link they're making, yes.
And this core socialist group, they're actively promoting specific political figures with highly radical platforms. Who are they campaigning for at this event?
They were distributing flyers for Azar Sultana. She's a current Muslim member of parliament, one of 25, and her platform is one of radical economic transformation. She explicitly advocates for a socialist transformation of the country.
And what does that mean in practice? What specifically does she want to nationalize?
Her platform targets utilities, energy, transport, and, critically, communications, including the internet.
The internet.
The internet. The source material draws a very sharp parallel here, noting that nationalizing communications and the entire means of production echoes the disastrous economic and political policies implemented by historical communist regimes. They specifically cite the authoritarian control seen under figures like Lenin and Stalin. It's a call for total state control over the economy and the media infrastructure. And this political extreme is further reinforced by the deep links between Catherine Hayani, the paid organizer, and the former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn.
Right. The Corbyn connection is significant because it highlights this historical pattern of the hard left embracing anti-Western extremists. The sources detail his background meticulously.
They do. Corbyn, a hard-left socialist and an MP since 1983, has a documented history of association with individuals holding violent, extremist Islamic ideologies. The sources remind us that just 6 months before he became the Labour leader, Corbyn welcomed a group of known Islamic extremists right into Parliament.
Who were some of these figures? What do they represent?
Well, the list is sobering. It included David Abdullah, who had publicly supported attacks on the Royal Navy and boycotted Holocaust Memorial Day. Also, there was Azam Tamimi, a man who openly stated his desire to carry out a suicide attack.
He said that publicly.
He did. Zahar Abarawi, known for his close ties to Hamas leadership, was also present. Corbyn was also photographed with Abdal Bari Atwan, who expressed delight at the idea of Iran attacking Israel. This pattern just illustrates a willingness by the hard left to align with any group, no matter its anti-democratic or violent intent, if it shares a common enemy in the West.
And Catherine Hayani, the paid organizer, she cemented her place within this hardline alignment immediately after the October 7th attacks.
Yes, she hadn't been active on social media for over a year, but she returned specifically to post content defending Hamas. This is a clear indicator that the organizing structure of this protest movement views designated terror organizations not as terrorists, but as legitimate resistance.
And that leads us directly to the most worrying connection that's detailed in the source material. The link between these activists and the UK-designated terrorist organization, Palestine Action.
Right. And Palestine Action is not a peaceful protest group. The UK designates them as a terrorist organization. Their methods, as detailed in the sources, include the release of an underground manual online.
What's in that manual?
It provides instructions on how to form activist cells, how to evade police detection, and most alarmingly, a map of UK targets.
And their actions have been violent, too.
They've physically struck a police officer with a sledgehammer during one attack. And the irony here is palpable. Azara Sultana, the socialist MP being promoted by the SWP at the protest, publicly endorsed this group. She posted, "We are all Palestine Action."
So an MP endorsing a designated terror group.
It demonstrates an explicit ideological acceptance of terror-aligned methods within the hard-left political apparatus. And the sources show a direct correlation between this radicalization and real-world consequences.
Such as?
Following an incident where activists damaged two military tanker aircraft at a Royal Air Force base, the Socialist Workers Party, the core organizational group at the protest, escalated the situation, which led to the arrest of 532 SWP protesters.
532.
That is a massive drain on British policing and legal resources, and it demonstrates that the cost of this funded activism is borne directly by the British taxpayer.
Okay, let's trace the money, because the financial data provided in this investigation is probably the most compelling evidence of the professional, organized nature of this whole operation. We're looking specifically at the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the PSC.
The PSC figures show an extraordinary and exponential cash injection over a very short period of time. In 2023, the total income for the PSC was £746,000. They were actually running a deficit of £157,000, leaving their net assets at just £253,000. They were not financially robust.
So what happens when we look at their 2024 annual accounts, the period covering the time immediately after the conflict escalated?
The income soared to over $3.3 million.
$3.3 million.
It's nearly a five-fold increase in their annual income. Net assets ballooned from £253,000 to £1.8 million. Donations and membership contributions alone jumped from £688,000 to over £3.1 million. This is a monumental influx of capital, and it suggests a highly successful, organized, and perhaps international fundraising push.
And despite this massive sudden surge, the source material notes a pretty concerning lack of transparency regarding where this wealth actually came from.
Exactly. The PSC publishes no detailed donor list. They maintain that they accept no corporate or government cash. This leaves the source of that sudden 3.1 million increase in donations highly opaque. It raises serious questions about whether the funding is domestic or if it flows through international, perhaps non-state channels.
And the money trail for other groups like the Stop the War Coalition, the organization that's employing the paid protesters, that trail actually leads right back to the United States political infrastructure.
It does, through the mechanics of digital fundraising. When you go to donate to the Stop the War Coalition, that transaction is processed by a platform called Action Network. This is a U.S.-based digital fundraising platform that the source material specifically describes as being deeply embedded in Democratic Party infrastructure.
So Action Network raises money for the Democratic Party in the U.S.
Significant funds, yes, for the Democratic National Committee and related campaigns.
So the irony here is pretty thick. You have individuals in London pushing a hard-left, anti-Western socialist agenda, defending groups like Hamas, and they're being financially enabled through a fundraising network that is a key technological and financial component of mainstream U.S. political finance.
It demonstrates the deep interconnectivity and the globalization of political activism and funding. Finally, we need to note the involvement of groups that are explicitly targeting young people. A group called Friends of Allah, or FOA, was present at the protest.
And this group's founder has openly saluted Hamas, right?
Yes, stating they are no terrorist organization. FOA also has its own history of questionable political financing. They raised £10,000 for Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaign in 2015, a check which was never declared, and it led their bank to actually close their account due to compliance concerns.
So what are they doing at these protests now?
FOA runs a program called Little Steps for Palestine. It's explicitly designed to involve children in protesting. The investigator noted that there were significantly more children present at this London demonstration than at any U.S. protest they had ever attended.
And other groups are doing this too.
Yes. Compounding this, the Stop the War Coalition, the paid organization, even created a guide instructing people on how to organize school strikes. This is a clear, systematic effort to indoctrinate and mobilize British youth into this specific political and ideological movement.
Moving from that financial infrastructure to the reality on the ground is where this ideology really collides with the daily lives and contradictory viewpoints of Londoners.
This section really captures the direct ideological friction and the deeply divided social fabric of contemporary London. It moves us beyond the funding and into the specific rhetoric and personal conflicts.
Let's start with the most aggressive rhetoric observed, the chant, "Death to the IDF." The investigator challenged a protester directly on the severe implication of that slogan.
Right. The interviewer noted that in Israel, military service in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, is mandatory for almost all citizens. So therefore, chanting death to the IDF is functionally equivalent to calling for the death of Israelis as a whole.
And how did the protester respond to that?
Well, initially he argued this wasn't true. He was suggesting many Israelis refuse to serve or that they resist the government.
But what was the critical moment of admission?
The protester ultimately admitted that the implication that almost every Israeli is directly implicated by that chant was something he had not considered.
He hadn't thought it through.
It speaks volumes about the semantic avoidance and really the lack of critical empathy that's embedded in the movement's core slogans. The message is violent, but the participants claim they only mean the organization, ignoring the civilian reality behind the uniform.
And now we encounter Curie Tongues, an organizer who seems to perfectly embody the deep ideological contradictions inherent in this radical London activism. She's an organizer, a paid protester, and most notably, she's a teacher.
Tongues has taught for 27 years, and she was a former president of the National Education Union. Her dual role shaping young minds as a teacher while acting as a hardline paid organizer is highly symbolic. She physically attempted to push the investigator off a public street, stating they got a job to do.
It demonstrates that confluence of political extremism and the education system.
It does, and her specific ideological position is almost impossible to reconcile, according to the sources.
How so?
She is a socialist feminist organizer. She publicly advocates for pro-women's and LGBT rights. Her social media posts show solidarity with Cuba and advocacy for policies like allowing men in women's locker rooms. She even organizes these anti-hate Zooms.
Okay.
Yet the source notes she is simultaneously pro-Islamic immigration into the UK.
And why is that a fundamental contradiction in the context of the source material?
The source material defines this as cognitive dissonance, because that pro-immigration stance enables the advancement of cultural and religious practices associated with certain conservative Islamic jurisdictions that are fundamentally antithetical to Western feminist principles.
Like what?
We are talking about practices such as wife-beating and child marriage, which have been documented in parts of the UK. The source concluded that without individuals like Tongues, who bridge that radical progressive ideology with conservative Islamic political movements, Islamic ideology would have never penetrated the UK education system and political mainstream to this extent. She acts as a vital, highly placed enabler.
This ideological intersectionality continued when the investigator encountered the London Irish Brigade.
This was a small group, and they were protesting for occupied Ireland, meaning the 6 counties in Northern Ireland, and supporting Irish prisoners on hunger strike. This is a textbook example of disparate anti-establishment groups uniting against a common perceived enemy, the UK and the West.
And who do they align with internationally? Who are their brothers and sisters?
They explicitly stated they support their Palestinian brothers and sisters. And the source material clarifies that in this context, this means alignment with Hezbollah. The connection is physical proofs. One of their band members was charged with a terror offense for waving the Hezbollah flag at a prior event.
So for the London Irish Brigade, the fight in Palestine is a proxy war against the UK political establishment.
That's how it's framed.
Now, moving beyond the organized groups, we hear the voices of those London residents who are terrified or disgusted by what is happening, starting with a powerful counter-voice, an Iranian asylum seeker.
This individual arrived in London 2 years ago, but he came specifically to counter the protest movement, not to join it. His warning to the UK is incredibly dire because it is rooted in personal lived experience.
What's his warning?
He warns that Islam is coming to England. He compares the situation to the Islamic Republic coming here, and he warns that freedom will be finished.
So he believes the Islamic revolution that he escaped from in Iran is starting to happen on the streets of London.
Exactly. He is supporting Trump, stating that Trump is strong against Islamic protest and is the only figure who can stop the Islamic stuff in the West. It highlights a fascinating tension. An asylum seeker escaping theocracy, now urging the UK to adopt a harder line against the very ideology he fled.
And it's a stark contrast to the Syrian man who is leveraging the system.
A very stark contrast. And this man, the Iranian, he faced personal consequences for speaking out too.
What happened?
He and his girlfriend were attacked by Arab individuals at a counter-protest in Wembley. Despite having video evidence, the Metropolitan Police closed his case due to no evidence, though one attacker was apparently deported. It illustrates the vulnerability of those who speak against the dominant, organized political tide on London's streets.
The emotional toll of this cultural clash is best captured, I think, by the disgusted patriot, an older Englishman who was interviewed at the scene.
His words are just filled with a sense of profound betrayal and loss. He felt London was done due to mass immigration. And critically, he lamented the chilling effect on public discourse. He said, "I'm a racist if I disagree with this," articulating his feeling that he has no acceptable voice to dissent about immigration or cultural policy.
And his critique of UK policy was very targeted and specific, especially regarding the asylum boats.
He cited the deal the police have with France to stop the boats, but only if they are empty. He called it a fucking pointless policy if they just allow boats with people in them to continue arriving. He really represents the voice of the national identity, feeling overwhelmed and poorly defended by his own government.
But he's not giving up.
No. Despite the despair, he vowed to stay and fight for the rights his grandparents fought for, stating, "I'll be here till the end."
And finally, let's examine the perspective of the tolerant cosmopolitan, a white woman who hadn't lived in London for years. Her position really demonstrates the philosophical limits of progressive tolerance.
She represents the extreme end of multicultural resignation. When she was asked about the prospect of London becoming 90% Muslim, she just stated, "Fine, why not?" She asserted she was okay with being a minority in her own country.
What was her reasoning?
She reasoned that we are all mungus in England, we're a mixture. It suggests a complete abandonment of any fixed national or cultural identity in favor of this aggressively fluid, amorphous, multicultural identity.
But the interviewer pushed this tolerance to its breaking point by introducing the concept of Sharia law. She initially dismissed it, correct?
She did. She claimed Sharia law was not my business because she's not a Muslim. But when the interviewer presented the specific detail that certain interpretations of Sharia law allow a husband to beat his wife, a direct affront to the feminist principles of the West, she explicitly rejected it. She said, "No, it's not acceptable."
But what happened when she was forced to confront the reality that this might become the dominant legal structure if the demographics shift in the way she just accepted?
Her moral objection just dissolved into resignation. She concluded that if Sharia law were to take hold, she would have to cope with it.
Have to cope with it.
And this is the philosophical breakdown revealed in the source material. Tolerance, when pushed to its extreme, becomes capitulation. It lacks any intellectual or moral mechanism to defend its own core liberal values.
And the final scene of the investigation provides the starkest visual evidence of this ideological fissure on the street level.
It was an incredible moment.
Yeah.
The police had to intervene to protect a single woman who was displaying a British flag from the larger mob of protesters. The police officer confirmed that they might have to remove her.
Not because she was breaking the law.
No, explicitly because she would be unsafe from the surrounding organized protesters. This is the clearest evidence that, in contemporary London, the mere expression of traditional English patriotism requires police protection from an intolerant, organized political movement that feels emboldened to use intimidation and force.
So let's synthesize what we've uncovered today. The sources we've dissected, they paint a picture of a nation under intense pressure where ideology and finance are just deeply interwoven.
We've documented a massive, professionalized, and internationally funded activist infrastructure. We saw the PSC's income soar to over £3.3 million in just 1 year, benefiting from these opaque donor channels.
And we found those clear links between the paid organizers and U.S. political fundraising platforms like Action Network, demonstrating that hard-left, anti-Western socialism is being financially enabled through mainstream international political finance.
We also uncovered the profound policy contradictions and the financial strain of the asylum system. The Syrian man's story revealed this transnational utilization of European welfare systems and his candid plan to voluntarily return to his home country after securing free UK education and saving money. It challenges the very premise of refugee status while costing the UK taxpayer billions annually.
And finally, we documented the profound ideological collision on the streets. We saw the hard left abandoning core feminist principles to align with anti-Western Islamic political movements, the explicit rejection of democracy as from the West by asylum beneficiaries,
And the stark reality that just expressing national identity now requires police protection from an organized, aggressive mob.
The source material presents a collision course where core Western values are really struggling to defend themselves against internally and externally funded ideological opponents.
And this leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, building on the collapse of that tolerant cosmopolitan stance. If an organized, well-funded ideological movement explicitly rejects democracy as its foundation and views tolerance as a weakness to be exploited, as these sources suggest. How does a democratic society defend its institutions, its laws, and its core liberal values without abandoning those very principles of tolerance and free expression?
The next deep dive, we understand, will look at the physical manifestations of this conflict in the form of Sharia law zones that are emerging within the UK.
Think about the physical space that ideological resignation creates, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.